So I'm notoriously bad with a handheld mic. I'm going to do this a lot. So if I do and you can't hear me, just yell. I talk with my hands, so this is going to be a real interesting challenge. So what I'm here to talk to you guys about for the next 15 minutes is actually probably more tactical than most of what we've been thinking about this morning. And I just want to say off the top, if nothing else, I want to plant a seed, which is to think about how you can co-design with your users, your customers, your members, and so on. In 15 minutes, you're not going to get the full how to do everything from beginning to end, but I'd like to give you kind of a preview and an overview of what participatory design actually is and how you can use it in your practice. And from there, happy to chat, happy to talk. There's lots of resources that I can share with you afterwards. But as you've been thinking about all these ideas this morning, maybe now you can start to ask, how do I accomplish some of those? There might be some seeds for thought here. So what I want to present to you is essentially what is participatory design, how and why you might want to use it in your practice, how it's been successful for others and myself and a few others that you might be thinking about, oh, well, is this relevant to me? And then what it looks like and how you can use it. So I want to start with this pretty common quote. Maybe you've heard it from Henry Ford. And I would say if I had $1 for every time I've heard this quote used in conversations about innovation, I'd probably be retired. And if I had another $1 for every time I heard this quote being misused as a way to justify not working directly with customers or users, I would be like founding charities. So I like to push back on this quote a lot, partially because we don't actually know if he said it, and it's not really actually documented that he did, but also because I think it does get misused in that way. So I would basically want to challenge us to say, well, if talking to people and asking them what they want isn't going to work, then what are we actually supposed to do? So that's where participatory design comes in. So when we talk about participatory design or co-design or any of the different terms that people tend to use, what do we mean? I apologize, the font is wrong on this, so if it's a little bit hard to see, the slides for this will be a little bit better, I think. So essentially, it's an approach to design that involves the people that you are designing for in the process. It's that simple. It's not a variation on things you are probably already familiar with. It's not just another form of focus groups or interviews. There's a little bit more to it than that. It's not just a way to make your users do your work for you. So sometimes I hear that, like participatory design, you mean I'm gonna get them in a room and make them do my design work for me? No. It's not just a single prescriptive method or tool. So if you're looking for a general how to do it, here's how to always do it the same way every time, that's not really going to be what we get at. And it's not going to be a rigidly defined process either. The most important thing is that it's not a holy grail. It's not going to solve everyone's problems. It's not the thing that everybody's going to do from now on. But what it is a new tool or a new method for many organizations, especially in financial services, who are waking up to the value of design thinking and a lot of what Greg and Adam have talked about. As the design process and strategic thinking mature in an organization, this becomes one extra thing you can add to the toolkit to make those realities happen. So in short, it's a way of actually involving the people that we're designing for. All right? If you take nothing else away from today, it's hopefully that if you think about design in a co-design way, it means you actually bring them into the process, not just ask them what they want. I like to show this graph to give this a little bit of context because I'm going to talk about how to actually put this into practice, but I want to point out what a lot of people think of today as design and what most people are familiar with is over on this end, a more expert-driven design. And that's really what most people have done over the last few decades as design has grown in the consciousness, especially in the Western world. We think about design from an expert mindset. I'm a designer. I might go out and do work to understand your needs. I'll interview you, I'll talk to you, I'll really understand what your problems are, but then I'm gonna go away and disappear into the design Batcave and come up with my problems, or my solutions to your problems. And that's actually pretty different from a participatory mindset, where we actually look at our users as co-creators, and we involve them in the process rather than saying, we're gonna solve your problems for you. Now, I'm not saying that participatory design is better than an expert-driven mindset. They're simply two different windows looking into the same room. They're two different ways of approaching a given design problem. And so to put these in context with each other, I think is helpful because there are times where this type of work is important and necessary, and there are times where co-designing with folks is probably going to be more successful. And part of the reason we want to talk about it today is because these types of co-design or participatory design methods actually help uncover latent and undefined needs that you might miss in more traditional expert-led design processes. You'll also notice there's a vertical axis that has to do with whether design activities are more research or design-led. More for context, we can talk more about that later, but essentially it's to give it this sort of context, to look at different methods and where they fall. And so when you hear people talking about participatory design or co-design, this is kind of what they're talking about in contrast with things you already know about. User-centered design, types of generative research activities, where ethnography and contextual inquiry and research activities fall. This is, again, just to give it a sense of what I'm telling you about is not the way to do it from now on. It's just one extra tool for the toolkit. So when in the design process does doing participatory design or involving these types of methods make sense? Well, I will give you the overview of how we like to approach design at MadPow. And this is not something we invented. This is actually modeled on the double diamond diagram from the UK Design Council. So it probably looks familiar to a lot of you. But essentially, we start with a divergent process. As Greg was talking about earlier, it's going to be a series of divergent and convergent phases where we look first to discover and take in as much information as we can through foundational research. And then we start to focus and identify themes and patterns as we synthesize those findings. Then we move to another divergent phase where we're ideating and brainstorming and all the things you see on TV with Post-its on whiteboards. And then we're focusing again on perhaps the highest value ideas and prototyping and so forth. And we evaluate and we repeat this process. But where in this process would co-design or participatory design make the most sense? Well, I tend to look at it in two ways. If you do it earlier in the process, you'll find that what you get out of participatory design is going to be higher level and more conceptual. So you might gather members in a room and work with them in co- or participatory design methods, and what you'll get aren't going to be necessarily viable solution concepts, but more principles, general insights, things that might be enriching the research you're already doing. If you wait until you've done the discovery and have a lot of solid research synthesized, and instead you involve your co-design methods in the later phases of a project, you can actually get viable solution concepts and maybe even prototypes, depending on what you're designing. And both of these are great. It just depends on what you're looking to do and what you're looking to solve for. So for some people who say to me, isn't what you're describing just another form of research? Sure, if you use it in that phase in that way. But if you put people in a room with materials or the language to articulate their needs, they might actually be able to design potential concept solutions that you can then go and refine further. So why is it useful? Well, this is a quote from Liz Sanders, who's a woman who's pioneered a lot on this topic and one of the original people that I learned a lot about this work from. Essentially, it's a way of giving people a language to talk about their needs. Not everyone's a designer. I know that's in direct contradiction with some of the quotes from earlier today. Not everyone thinks of themselves as a designer, and instead of forcing them to change their sense of identity, we can give them a language they don't have. So when we involve people in co-design methods, we're basically doing that. We're giving them the ability to articulate their needs and then figure out what they're going to need, whether from us or from themselves, to be able to build their own solutions. A couple resources, I'll just skip through that real quick. But this is what the output looks like. And you're looking at this and you're like, that doesn't look like viable solutions. This is an example where we did activities that produced weird, funny things, but what we got out of this were tons of great insights and, most importantly, concepts that would then go on into development. And this was done by people who were customers saying, you know what, I need this thing to work this way. We didn't do a traditional interview or a focus group. Those folks created those things. Those things on that table were not realistic. This is an example where nurses were co-designing the floor plan for a workstation around what their ideal workflow would be. The thing they made is actually a viable solution. It's essentially a floor plan that an architect would then say, all right, I think I can make this work. So the fidelity of what you get out of the process depends on what it is you put in and what you're looking for. This is a diagram that I think kind of pulls in the value of those making activities in a way that contrasts with interviews or other activities you're familiar with. So in essence, if you think about what most people do for research just off the bat, we're familiar with interviews and focus groups. When you do that, you are getting at a sort of surface level of understanding, and it's not, I'm not saying that's bad, it's just essentially the first level, the tip of the iceberg. But when you actually observe people and use more ethnographic methods, you're going to uncover things that they do. They didn't necessarily say they did them, but you find that they do. You go one step deeper, and instead of just talking to people or observing them, you actually have them involved in making things. You're going to actually uncover those deepest, latent, tacit, unspoken needs. So again, this isn't a replacement for methods, it's just a way to go deeper. So for example, I want to talk about a little bit of work we did with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Mass. And I know sometimes people approach this type of topic and say, well, this is all well and good if this is product design, or we're doing blue sky innovation from the beginning. But this is also useful even when you are doing something like redesigning an existing website. We were redesigning a member portal, and we basically got members in a room and said, tell us what you need. Tell us what you expect. Not just an interview or a focus group about opinions, but actually, if you could design a magic screen that could do anything you wanted, what would it do? And they told us things like, yeah, this company knows so much about me, it should be able to literally predict the future and preempt my needs altogether. And we got insights out of that process that weren't just make it easy to navigate, make it easy to use, make it easy to find what I need, but rather that it needed to be predictive and anticipatory. So the design focused on anticipatory design in a way that would offer people suggestions and offer to solve certain things before they realized they needed them. When they arrived at the site, there would be a top suggestion based on all the data that this company had around this member. And so it's not always super mind-blowing. Sometimes it's as simple as, we thought the focus was going to be on ease of navigation. In fact, the focus was on make sure that you know who is there, show them you know them, and actually anticipate their needs. And so this comes from that co-design mentality, a bit of a philosophical shift from just, let me interview you, let me go away and design it and come back and see if you can use it. These people actually created this site. Another quick example from a company that was focused on, in this case, a billing project. Now, that's not viable. Press in case of billing frustration, I can't prototype that. But what I did was ask people, what does that do when you press it? And I'll say this a few times. The most important thing when you do these types of sessions is not what people make or create, it's what they say about it. It's how they talk about it. And what they say is going to give you design principles or direction. In this case, what does that do when you press it? That basically gave us a list of features and use cases to design. And that came out of a co-design session, very different from what we would get in a simple interview. So when you do this type of work, there are 4 things you're going to think about. And I'll just zip through these very quickly. I don't expect that folks are here to take notes and learn this like a workshop, but just again to plant the seed for what you can find online. These slides will be available, so happy to share and chat with you later. But essentially, you have to think about framing the process to work as efficiently and in most valuable way as possible, and also planning the logistics of it. The actual facilitation is another part that people don't tend to think about, but there are lots of things that you can do to make sure that you are going to get the most value from these sessions, because we know at the end of the day, even if you're gung-ho about the idea of getting, say, 10 customers in a room to do some participatory design, what are you going to have to show for it? And how are you going to convince somebody to pay for the logistics of that? So part of that is how you facilitate and how you capture, and then how you analyze the insights that you get from it as well. When you're framing up a co-design or participatory design session, these are the things you'll want to think about. Most important on this list is probably the assumptions and hypotheses, because that's the part that a lot of people skip. Trying to identify what it is you're assuming and then figuring out whether those assumptions are correct is probably key for most research activities. One of the most common questions I get is around choosing activities. What do you do in a participatory design session? So just at a high level, there are lots of types of activities you can do, but it comes down to figuring out what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so when I talk about generative activities, making, and how, remember in that diamond pyramid diagram, why is it important to get people making stuff? Because making is going to help them uncover things they can't put into words. So I almost always say you've got to have some kind of generative or making activities. But the other stuff can be folded in there as well. So there are a lot of activities, for example, narrative activities, that are going to look familiar to you. Oops. Like journey mapping. But in this case, we're not talking about journey mapping that designers create after doing a bunch of research. We're talking about journey maps you might do directly with users, or actually have them create the journey maps. Why should I, the designer, be making the map? Why don't I have them create it? It's their experience. So let them create it and then talk about it. So it's just a matter of taking some common activities and putting the members or users into the seat of the designer or the co-creator. These are just some examples of collages that people have done. And collages are great because when you think about a collage, you're like, oh, it's just putting pictures together. But then get them to talk about it and you'd be amazed at what comes out of it. Empathy maps. Now, I mentioned generative activities. Generative activities, sometimes people say, well, I'm not doing physical stuff. I'm not designing physical products. So how do I do that? How do I actually have them create something? They're not carpenters. They can't make things. Again, go for something like a magic screen or a magic button. Take these pipe cleaners and this construction kit and make a magic object that would solve all of your problems related to banking. Put that prompt in front of people and see what they make. They're going to stare at the pipe cleaners for 20 minutes. They're going to say, I'm not playing with that stuff. Then they're going to start tinkering with it. They're going to start telling about the story about the time they had this happen, or their brother's cousin's friend had this happen, and that this thing would have been really great if this magically thing could do that. And then suddenly what you've got is an idea or a concept you might not ever have thought of and realize that's doable. We can actually create something that does that. Another category that's pretty common are reflective activities. Things you might have done before, like card sorting, but physically, hands-on. And so in this case, it's not just using an online tool, very convenient, I use them all the time to do a card sort, but actually to watch someone stand there as they try to figure out where they want to place something. That's an act of co-creation. That's not just me like telling you my experience. I'm hemming and hawing over which category this goes in, and I can ask you, what are you thinking about as you do that? Well, I'm thinking about whether this lives here or here, and here's how my brain constructs this meaning. So if I put that person in a co-design role in the driver's seat to talk about it, I'll learn a lot more about what their needs are and how I can solve them. I'll skip that guy real quick. So the last couple of things, as I mentioned, are about planning. There's a list of things to think about. If you look this up later and you say, I think I could give this a try, or you know what, I want to share this with some of my team. There's just common things to think about and common things to plan for. The materials you use could vary from just pens and Post-its to buying like full kits of stuff or creating things. Go to the Michael's scrapbooking aisle and just buy everything in the aisle. You can use anything you want to make stuff. The whole point is to just get people to use their hands and then talk about what kind of problems they're trying to solve. Facilitating is something that I think people learn over time, but there are some important things about how to capture value. And the most important piece here about asking people what they're experiencing, I think I said that before, I'll say it a couple more times as well. It's not what they make that matters, it's how they talk about it. So you want to get them to talk about what they're making. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Right? So it's what they're actually thinking about as they make something and what problems they're solving. You are literally giving someone a language to speak in a way they haven't had before. So that's the value of it. So I wanted to come back at the end here just to say the whole point of chatting to you about this very tactical method, we've been talking about experience strategy and high-level thinking and hopefully some inspirational stuff. I hope you leave here today not just saying, yeah, this is great. There are people thinking about this. They're trying to solve the same types of problems. But more importantly, that there are methods out there today that you can actually start to bring in, even in baby steps. Even if you can't convince your entire organization to take on the concept of acknowledging our users and our members as co-creators in a future, you're going to have the execs saying, no, I don't know what that even means. But you can find the baby steps to start taking now, and these methods are out there, and co-design and participatory design is particularly valuable because it actually shifts the philosophical approach to design that you're doing. So hopefully this is, if nothing else, a seed that we can plant for you to think about. So instead of asking people what they want, as that Henry Ford quote alluded to, let's actually give them the language and the tools to show us what they want, or maybe even better than that, actually create it for themselves. So, thank you.